So I wanted to welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us in this series of webinars that we've been doing with the NPD team here for the past, I don't know, I want to say maybe probably 8 months. So we can go ahead and get started there, Jenna, if you'd like. You might want to, I think we're on presenter view. Okay, cool.
Are we all set?
Swap your screen, Mike. Hit display settings. And then
there you go. Perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right. We can go to the next slide there, Mike. Or so for the agenda, we're just going to do the introductions very quickly, just of the speakers. Frank's going to get us started and just cover some of the GTDC research that we've put out there recently. And then Mike's going to take over and go over the following items here: the enterprise market, the data center trends, emerging technologies, and Q&A. If you guys have any questions, you can certainly wait until the end and pose them live, or if you guys want to submit them through the chat, we can handle it that way too. For this particular session, we are going to have polling again. We did it last time. I thought it worked really well. So NPD and I, we kind of talked about it. So we have about 4 questions here. If we get through them all, that'd be great. And you can just respond to it right there. So Mike, the next slide there, I think is just the, so we have Frank kicking us off, followed by Mike. So without much longer here, wait, Frank, if you want to go ahead and lead us in.
Yep. Thanks. Thank you, Kavita. And welcome everybody. As Kavita mentioned, this is part of an ongoing series that we've been doing for quite some time. Early into last year we started it. Although we've changed the name, I hope you see that it's now called Channel Chat, which I think is a pretty spiffy name. I like that. And so what we're going to do is, what I'd like to do is spend a couple minutes and just give you an overview of some of the things that we at GTDC have done recently. And then, of course, I'll turn it over to Mike, and he's got some really interesting stuff that I'll highlight in a minute. So a couple things on this slide that you're looking at. First of all, in the middle, we have the 3 sort of pictures in the middle are the covers of 3 papers we've recently released. Distribution's Edge was released in the 4th quarter. Still qualifies as recently, I guess. And it was an analysis of routes to market for all of the ICT products and software and services. And it, did a pretty good job of showing the value of distribution. And so I know we get a lot of channel chiefs and vendor executives and vendor folks on the calls. And, they constantly get asked inside their company how to demonstrate the value of DISTI and why are we investing in DISTI, et cetera. And I think this tool that's built into this report will help you do exactly that, be able to demonstrate the value of DISTI. So that was done in the 4th quarter. We also released a pretty comprehensive paper on fraud. And as many of you know, it's constant. It's been happening in the channel for a long time. It continues to happen. I'm not sure we really saw an uptick during the pandemic, but what we saw was it was more impactful because we had a lot of solution providers. Obviously, their business was down. Cash flow was down, and they just couldn't risk having an incident. So in this paper, what we do is we spend a lot of time talking through the common types of fraud situations and the types of things that folks in the channel on all ends, both vendors and distributors and solution providers, can do to prevent fraud from happening, so we don't get in a situation where we've got to fix a problem. And then lastly, in I think it was mid to late January, where we released sort of our view of the 2021 outlook and how distribution played in that, the major trends, and where DISTI's playing. So those are all available on our website, all pretty current. And then in addition, I know we've probably talked about this before, but we started a new sort of series called Did You Know? And so every month we're going to provide some interesting facts and information regarding what's going on in distribution on a global basis. So it might be an overview of the numbers. It might be a certain category that, is doing really well. It might be a strategy that's happening. It could be a lot of things. But you'll see that and it'll be posted on our site. January, February are done. You'll see March here soon. So with that, let me turn it over. Mike's going to talk about, as Kavita said, the data center trends. This is a really important topic from my standpoint because we've spent a lot of time talking, recently about endpoints and, what's happening there. Mike's, I know, talked about segments, gov, and education in previous calls. Data center is key, and it's critical to the overall growth of the technology space. So it's really important to understand what's going on there and are these big projects that, most of us have all been associated with and are familiar with, are they coming back? And when will they come back? And most importantly, which I think is what Mike's going to focus on a little bit, is what's driving them from a technology standpoint. So with that, Mike, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, Frank. Thank you so much. And I guess we've got a question first. Kavita, if I turn to you on this, are you going to ask this question, or go ahead with you guys on this, and then we'll jump into the details. Kavita, let me know when we want to advance, and we'll keep moving.
Yep, I'll go ahead and I'm going to end it right here. We got quite a few folks who responded to it. So yeah, so as you guys can see here, 53% of you guys do believe that it will go back to pre-COVID in the second half of 2021, and 47% of you guys said no.
Awesome. Okay, great. So, and again, thank you everybody for attending. I'm excited to share with you some thoughts and some insights, certainly around the macro view, kind of the business where we see it now, and as we're right on the heels of really starting to see the improvement coming post-pandemic. A lot of pent-up demand and a lot of different focuses, a lot of different drivers. We're going to talk through some of those, and then I'm really going to key on some emerging technologies that I think not only are really exciting just from what they are, but also they tie very nicely within digital transformation, the momentum that's already been started, and now you're going to see this continue to drive the additional acceleration. And then lastly, we'll have a couple of final thoughts. So let's jump in. So first of all, I wanted to take a look and for everybody kind of give us a general positioning from the landscape and kind of where we sit. And where we sit is really just the massive change that's going on in our digital world. And I've only listed out just a few of these today, but there's certainly more of them. But as we already know, from a device proliferation and just the expansion of devices, it's growing at an exponential rate. And we're seeing that more and more and more in the data that it's driving, the data that it's consuming. So we're seeing that rate again continue. And as the economy continues to improve, we're also going to see that accelerate even faster. The other thing we're finding is a lot of this from a latency perspective, because a lot of that migration to the cloud, there's new needs and new dynamics around low latency. Forget even in the simple examples like gaming, but even in devices, smart cities, smart homes, autonomous vehicles, a whole host of things. There's a need for that really, really efficient and effective low latency. But also what comes with low latency, and we'll touch on a little bit deeper with edge, comes also some questions around security. So we're going to talk about those a little bit as well. The other one is we're seeing more smart devices. More devices are generating their own data on their own with AI and other integrated device technologies that are getting smarter, getting more efficient, or driving these. But again, they're generating massive amounts of data across the board. And then the last example I have was really around machine learning and AI, which we kind of touched on. But the ability to gain knowledge and understanding, find those efficiencies, and then be able to quantify those efficiencies, not only in savings, but in fact, we're going to talk a little bit more about perhaps seeing where these can help generate additional not only revenue, but also additional profits. So again, think of it just in the dynamics that are going on, and we're going to see that acceleration occur even faster now as the economy gets on both feet. So with that, we've touched on a lot of different things with the migration to the cloud and the efficiencies and the effectiveness of the cloud. But what you end up seeing ultimately now is different needs as they're evolving as well. There's centralization fundamentally in the structure of the cloud. The dynamic is changing in the fact of that latency is becoming now an issue. Well, it's not in relative terms a latency that's affecting it, but as you look at the hyperspeed that things are working in finance, in autonomous vehicles, as we talked about, or in medical applications, et cetera, that latency is critical. The other thing, I think there's still real lingering concerns around data privacy and security. And again, where everything is central, it puts significant risk on malware and other risk of exposing confidential information that I think a lot of people are very uncomfortable with. So with that, then you also now look at a more decentralized, and back to the point of edge isn't really going to take the place of the cloud, but it's more going to complement the cloud and help prioritize. Think now decentralized, you now can see really the true edge benefits that really come out. Not only the efficiencies of low latency, and again, how effective that's going to be, but also we have this infinite ability to scale. We also have a lot better way to address security concerns because again, they're distributed, they're decentralized. So think about those parallels that we've lived in our whole technology lives around centralization, then when the PC went to decentralized. Similar sized here, now decentralized. And again, it's going to be a critical point that cloud will not go away, but really edge is going to augment cloud in really those efficient, effective ways to prioritize. And then utilizing the lion's share of the cloud for more data repository and other things that are less time intensive. So look at the way that that's going to be prioritized. And a lot of companies are realizing now, especially they've migrated to the cloud, closer to the edge they get, the more efficient, more effective they're going to drive. And that's driving a lot of the push and a lot of the innovation going forward. So what I want to do now in each of these sections I go through, I'll give you kind of high level trends, current environment. Then we'll talk about use cases and some applications. So I think you guys can put some rubber to the road relative to, okay, what are the real life applications of some of these are. So leading off here again, data center overall, we're seeing, again, these major providers are responding not only to, saw that initial digital transformation occur in 2020, but there's a huge level of investment with pent-up demand. And because a lot of that excess capacity was consumed, there's a real need to grow and establish, especially because it's more even fundamental to where our businesses or where our technologies are leading us. Right now, based on a couple of different data sets, nearly 5% on a compound annual growth rate you're looking at between 21 and 26. So again, very sustained, aggressive growth is the expectation. I pulled some recent data too, as of Jan of 2021, 400 megawatts of new data center construction right now is currently underway just in the US. And if you look at each of these, they're all representing at least 100 megawatt and more, which is also driving a lot of different innovations around cooling and around power, because the consumption rate that's going on with these hyperscale data centers is going to be critical. So you're going to continue to see more and more projects under construction, and we're going to continue to see that investment. So very bullish on certainly second half on growth. And one of the things that makes people feel very comfortable in the past, there was a lot of expansion in data center, but that it was a little bit overbuilt, and that was the concern over capacity. Now, when you look at it, and at least with these projects that I've outlined for this year, for 2021, you've fundamentally got 100% of them pre-leased. So again, very healthy, very pent-up demand, a lot of new construction, and again, a lot of effort around these. Kavita, we got questions here?
Yep. So here you guys can see it. When do you think 5G will widely be available across the nation to enable edge computing and IoT? We've got a couple choices here. Okay, I'll give a couple more seconds. All right, I'm going to share the results here. Looks like the majority of you guys think it's going to be 2023. 33% at 2022, 13% at who knows, and 6% for this year.
Okay, so kind of talked about macro trends around data center, and now as we get into a little bit deeper, we'll start talking specifically about what are some of these other areas of growth and opportunity and certainly emerging technologies. One of the ones that I know we wanted to talk about a little bit today was on edge. And we just talked about a little bit of the high level. Let's go into a little bit deeper dive on kind of current environment and what are some of the other things that I've been able to call out. I wanted to make sure we could highlight for you guys today. We already know that COVID really, beyond obviously the significant negatives associated with loss and loss of life and all of the negatives associated, believe it or not, as we've seen, with that has also driven some positives in the sense of this catalyst for digital transformation. We saw that occur in 20, and it's definitely going to continue on the additional investments going on now beyond 20 and into 2021. A lot of those were just started very, very early stage, but there was also a lot of key learning that came out of some of those initial digital transformation projects that were implemented. And we also saw a significant gap between winners and losers, people that had embraced digital transformation early and took advantage of those efficiencies and effectiveness that ultimately made them successful in 2020. Got a couple of comments from IDC on this one, specifically on size. If you look at edge computing, overall on global spend, estimates right now are north of $250 billion over the next 4 years. So again, there's sustained need and demand as people are understanding more what's that true application and how does that align well with the way that I operate my business, not only today, but also for tomorrow. Another interesting point is where you're seeing this migration, as we talked about, so much data, and where it's having to go to the cloud and then process and then back. Now where we need it closer to where the data is actually driven. And this statistic really jumped out at me, that if you look at it right now, only about 10% is being operated today on the edge, where if you look in 2025, some estimates suggest it's going to be as high as 75% of the edge. So we're going to see that dynamic change relative to need of that higher level security, low latency, and all the efficiencies and effectiveness that edge is going to bring. And again, it's going to complement very nicely the way that the cloud is structured. Let's take a look at a couple of different things like opportunity and use case, because that's always nice where you can see the real application. And I've only listed now just a handful of these, but there's certainly multiples of this that we're seeing gain some acceleration. First off, with autonomous vehicles, we know the different technologies that are going to be required, and certainly low latency is going to be a critical commonality amongst all those. It's going to have to be hyper responsive and be able to manage that, along with integrating in other types of technologies like AI. Banking we touched on earlier, we know that transaction speed is critical. And I think between not only the speed of managing the transaction and the scalability of it, but also the data security of it has also been a critical question. And I think that's where edge is really going to start to shine within that vertical. Within healthcare, I think a lot of us have already seen some of the different aspects of what's going on now with even routine surgeries or even more complicated surgeries, integrating in AI, robotics, and other needs, but also there's going to be a critical piece around that latency and security. I mean, if these are dynamics that are going on in the next stage of healthcare, you can see the critical need to clearly have the technology ability to be able to support that. The other thing is we're getting smarter relative to factories and how factories are built, how they're constructed, how they're maintained. And a lot of this now with smarter factories, digital factories, and smart devices have the ability to be much more predictive around maintenance, around quality control, management of all aspects of the supply chain. So there's going to be that quick and low latency, rapid response that's going to be required. Looking at a couple of others that are really critical, again, look at military and defense. Drone fleet is a great example. So as drones are flying real time and need to understand targeting and defense and all those other elements, not to mention the security aspect. So clearly a lot of expansion in needs for some of those. The other one that we're going to talk about in the last one on this particular set of examples, digital supply chain and logistics, which is going to be really interesting, and that's part of what you guys do every day. But the intelligence that's going to go into not only monitoring and tracking inventory management, also down to things like smart labeling that we're going to talk about here in a second. So a lot of innovation, but clearly the commonality and need is really around speed and security, and that's what Edge is certainly going to bring to the table. Okay, let's move on to AI and machine learning a little bit. Again, positioning at least high level from kind of what we see and what's going on. A lot of what occurred early with AI, I think there was a lot of excitement around the technology, and I think wasn't a real clear identifier as far as how we're going to apply this day to day to really optimize our business operations. There was a fundamental understanding, but I think it hadn't, like many things, was kind of toe in the water pre-pandemic because it was a lot of emerging technology in use, but hadn't necessarily mainstreamed that as part of their business. Clearly, the pandemic accelerated a lot of those pretty significantly, and that's what we see now, a much different perspective relative to AI and what the investment has gone up 10x of where it was previously. And what they're really finding that it's most effective and most efficient in is identifying gaps in automation, things that they can automate to be more efficient, more effective, and again, ability to help scale their business. A lot of businesses found that they had to move to a digital model and a digital operating model and figuring out where and how they could take cost out and they could add efficiency in. And we certainly are seeing that more than ever now with AI. People are also seeing it now as strategic. They're really adding and looking critically at each of these automated kind of routine tasks and figuring out, can we, through AI and other means, automate and improve these, or we can now redeploy resources that we have as a company to really be more effective and efficient at serving customers directly. And I think that's going to be the real piece that's going to continue to be levered. And now it's being used offensively in companies to be able to do that. It's really about driving value is my next point. Yes, it drives efficiencies, but what a lot of companies I think are finding as well is they're not only finding they can find more efficiencies around the usage of AI, they're actually finding not only profit generators, but also even in some cases, revenue generators. So look for, again, more applications, more expansion, more thinking around AI, and again, integrating into a lot of these technologies that I'm talking about currently in this particular deck. The other thing, again, is they're going to critically use, major companies are critically using AI now to challenge really a lot of the current processes they have in company and looking at, can we find and are there ways that certainly can be utilized in a more efficient and more effective manner. Here's a couple of examples maybe that help illustrate kind of what I'm talking about. This concept of hyperautomation too, so it's even faster. And again, integrating multiple technologies along with robotics and AI. So they're learning, being smarter, and again, continuing to push the efficiency and the effectiveness. I think there's a lot of investment that's going to be made as you look at how they're going to integrate more fully robotics, and or is it a combination of? So it's a hyper kind of a structure. You're also seeing much more now in cybersecurity. A lot of companies, and there's also some risk with this, is that AI is driving a lot of the cybersecurity and a lot of people that are involved in this on a day-to-day. There is some concerns, though, about pattern identification and how likely is AI going to continue to start repeating patterns that may make it a little bit more visible to hackers and other things that are targeting the company. But today, I think they're finding ways, again, doing more with less. AI can act as a significant resource to help minimize the hard count of people and resources needed to be able to take advantage of more of a hyper way. The third example I want to talk about too is on IoT, but it's around AI IoT. And it's really around learning devices. So not only all the as we talked about, proliferation of IoT, but really more importantly, we're talking about now, can these devices learn and begin to find ways to optimize and find more effective and more efficient. And we're seeing more of that now. So again, a lot of the convergence on a lot of these technologies is something that we're seeing more and more and more of. The last example I'll give on this particular area is AI-enabled chips. We know right now there's some current challenges, certainly around chips just in a production level, but as the next gen of chips are being looked at, and how do we mirror and integrate, AI effectively in how these will operate, because of, again, the unique requirement that with AI draws a tremendous amount of power as well as consumption of processing power. There need to be find ways that these can be constructed efficiently to be able to leverage what AI can bring, but also have it be able to operate efficiently within a lot of these devices and a lot of these systems. So a lot of interesting things coming around. And again, I want to make sure these are great on their own, but as you're looking through each of these emerging technologies, you can certainly see a lot of different areas where these are converging for a modified kind of conglomerate solution. Let's take a break here on these, then we'll move on to the next topic. Let's jump into this question number 3.
Yep, let me go ahead and launch that. So do you think that security will continue to be an issue for IoT in the next year? Okay, I'm going to end the polling here. So overwhelmingly, slightly, 100% of you guys said yes.
Which is good because it actually, I think there are, as we're going to talk further about on IoT, there's certainly some areas that are going to require a lot of different things to occur to ensure that we can maintain that level of safety. All right, so let's jump in. In fact, great segue into IoT. This one's an interesting one too, as we sort of look through some of the topics. On this one, we certainly, and many people saw IoT and that expansion of IoT was still at fairly early stage, certainly identified within businesses as a growth and transformational kind of a technology, but I think it was still early in the learning. And I think as we, like most things that we saw in technology, how it applied to the pandemic, we saw really IoT become a much more kind of a critical technology, specifically in healthcare is the example I'm giving here, really around the ability to monitor and aid in that patient care and management. Because again, it was all about social distancing. It was all about being as comfortable as we could be in these very difficult situations and circumstances where you couldn't have that one-on-one engagement. So there was a lot of pressure on some of these new devices to become much more effective and efficient at helping us maintain that distance, at the same time still managing what were all the critical needs that we had. The other thing that we saw a lot of movement around some intelligent and connected supply chains, is the new kind of a evolving kind of structure that we're seeing, where there's a lot of new use cases really around smart labeling and technology and the ability to help efficiently track and trace. In fact, we're going to talk a little bit about that around smart labels, where some of the new technology that it's emerging, they're getting the costing down now to such a level, and they're designing with a biodegradable structure in place, where whatever that's going to come about relative to this, it needs to make sure that the battery is able to be biodegradable, processor, all the rest of the physical piece of the labeling. And they've come a long way. In fact, there are examples of that coming out here this year that are even using fish scale substrate as an example that's going to, again, biodegrade in water. We saw you. So a lot of advances really around IoT and IIoT on the industrial side, specifically around not only the hard applications like within healthcare, but also if you look at on a broader scale, back to that efficiency and effectiveness that can also happen with regard to these smart supply chains. Okay. So examples too of this, looking at again, use case and opportunity, certainly from a smart factory standpoint, again, having these identities where these are active assets that can be managed and tracked and understood relative to how they're efficiently operating, which is very, very interesting and going to be very, very effective again in minimizing downtime, maximizing productivity. You're going to see that more and more and more. And again, look for these to also converge on some of the other technologies we mentioned, specifically like with AI. So look for the intelligence to be built in. These will be learning devices, not only communicating kind of status and monitoring, but also being able to find efficiencies that can be also capitalized on. The other thing that we're finding, again, continuing on in health, look for these different devices to do different things now, and continuing on even post-pandemic around things like UV radiation monitoring. So monitoring and detection certainly, but also surveillance, also even just companion robots that are also doing assist in taking sample, delivering sample, and other means. So look at, again, convergence, but also look at ways that these are going to be not only smart devices, intelligent devices that can learn, but also integrating in multiple technologies into a common solution. We mentioned earlier about smart cities. And again, this can be controlling it across the board, leveraging edge, leveraging all the other things that we talked about with AI, but also in the way that can we manage smart lighting for the outdoor relative to surveillance. Toll collection, traffic management are just a few of these examples. But again, they can manage flows dynamically, and these are all going to be intelligent devices that are going to be communicating back to us. We also mentioned earlier on smart logistics, and we'll continue to see more and more of those examples to where I think you can leverage combining technologies to really find a nice, nice solution, not only for today, but also continue to get smarter as we find these growing in the future. Okay. Rita, last slide on questions?
Yep, pulling it up here. What's the largest disruption for robotic solutions in the supply chain? Okay, so looks like 50% of you guys believe it's implementation, followed by measuring ROI at 32% and selling the solution at 18%.
Great transition timing. Again, moving into the next category on robotics. And I think, again, as we've touched on, each of these emerging technologies on their own, I think brings significant value and significant opportunity for growth for you in the industry. I think as we look to now at that continued convergence, robotics is another area that I think makes a ton of sense. So we have seen, again, post-COVID, and it's not all that different than what we've already been talking about in other areas, that we're seeing really around the commonality around safety, driving a lot of not only the efficiencies that robotics certainly bring, and that's clear, but also I think the expectation, especially in environments where they're trying to keep and maintain that level of safe distance and operating ability within organizations. At the same time, they need to be able to maintain what's going on within the factory. Robotics specifically, I know we're seeing a lot of emergence in certain sectors are driving faster than others. And certain, I only mentioned 4 here between healthcare, manufacturing, and maintenance services. Again, post-pandemic has been a big area, I think, of increased usage. But they're also seeing really around essential kind of labeling because it's really stuff that they need to be able to be doing in these environments, again, from an automated standpoint on efficiency. At the same time, be able to protect that area that are traditionally managed by human workers. There's always been that lingering concern of robotics, is it taking away from jobs and other means? And I think what we're finding now is they're augmenting a lot of that, where they're taking away some of the most kind of mundane elements of what that can be and repeatable, then also expanding on a different work resources needed, not only to supervise, but also maintenance and technicians relative to supporting the robotic device itself. We're continuing to see, again, areas like focusing on productivity and efficiency. And again, that's the byproduct of really what robotics are supposed to be able to provide and deliver. And I think the challenge of that continues to be, as they continue to evolve and integrate more AI into a lot of these devices, ultimately, what does that mean for this kind of balance that needs to be maintained, really, between usage of robotics and human people managing those work, not only tasks, but also environments. A lot of the information that I've been able to glean out of a number of different areas is this thought around collaborative robotics and cobots. And it really is the fact that the expectation, while there's going to continue to be an escalation of robotic usage within some of these key industries, there's still going to be a need to where you're not going to see that direct displacement of these workers, but you'll see roles and functions change. But again, a lot of this collaboratively is the expectation on how this is going to continue to proceed. So look for continued investment again, and look for continued innovation. At the same time, I think there's a real purpose behind where and how these products and these technologies are being deployed, and how best can they collaborate again with that human counterpart. Let's look at a couple of examples of what I'm talking about. So again, we mentioned earlier with robotics on testing, and this came out again with the pandemic, is we saw if it was blood tests, if it was any other testing that needed to be done, there was a need to have that distance socially to be able to maintain that level of health. And I think you saw that those examples expand in certainly ways that they could utilize these, even down to the point now, and we've already seen this over the last few years, utilizing robotics in surgery. So again, AI aided, and you're seeing in some of these, not only in surgical planning, but you're also seeing robots work in concert with doctors in managing some of these actual procedures themselves. Robotics, we've seen a big emergence in e-commerce, and we've certainly seen that in DCs, even in distribution across the board as well, where they're from a pick, pack, and ship, order processing, or management, or tracking. We've seen that emerge even more. I mean, it's something that is, again, highly efficient, highly effective. And I think within most of these areas, it's a fairly clear and straightforward ROI. But again, it's not designed to take the place all of the human factor, but it's certainly there to augment what's going on. Manufacturing, we've seen this, and we're seeing this a little bit differently too with robotic process automation. So think more software than necessarily hardware as well. So looking at software, looking at these resources more as digital workers, and where and how can they be deployed, again, leveraging off AI to find the optimal on ways that they can be managing their particular tasks, but also, you know, from the longevity of that, and are they able to find additional efficiencies? You're seeing more and more of that becoming adopted in manufacturing. Then lastly, and again, this is very similar to what we saw in a lot of these efforts really around post-pandemic, around cleaning and disinfection. We've seen a lot of efforts, not only in the airline industry, but in education and schools, in other areas where you've got a large footprint. You're seeing automation come now through robotics around cleaning again and disinfection. You're seeing now things on airliners that are UV light. So it's UV light disinfection along with vaporizer and other technologies that are used in concert. So we're seeing, again, more of an emergence and more of a confluence of all these other technologies to basically drive a better overall solution. And it continues to see growth and momentum. And I think we're going to continue to see that. This is a big year for all of these that I had mentioned, really relative to where we see expansion, investment, and growth. And with that brings really opportunity for you guys relative to the technology and the services that ultimately go into these opportunities. Okay. So I had a couple of things that I wanted to cover, just last final thoughts, kind of if we look to summarize a lot of what I've covered today. As we've mentioned, the good news here where we saw a tough 2020 on data center, mainly because people couldn't get into the facilities. I mean, there was a lot of stalled projects relative to new construction and expansion. And here we see in 2021 and moving forward, we're going to continue to see a major upswing on investment. There's a real understanding now of data center critical infrastructure, and it's even more critical as that foundational technology that we're building everything else around the efficiencies coming with digital transformation. So clearly data center is going to be an anchor that really is going to help drive, facilitate incremental growth across all these other areas. We touched on it earlier with edge, low latency, security and reliability, huge factors in edge. We're going to continue to see that migration to edge data centers, moving processing to the edge, not only for all the things that we've mentioned on latency, but again, don't disregard the level of security that will bring being more distributed, and certainly the reliability of that with all the redundancy that's going to be built in. So look for that continued expansion and investment. Very bullish on where we see this going, certainly near term as the pandemic is nearing a a close and see certainly acceleration on the back half. I mentioned earlier on AI, again, I think there's a real new perspective around how people are viewing AI and how they can leverage these automation gains and finding those efficiencies. And again, as I talked, not only about cost reductions, it certainly will drive profit, but they're also finding ways that these can also be revenue drivers. So look for continued investment there and continued confluence of these other technologies to be able to leverage that in a really highly effective way. I mentioned IoT, and I love this idea again on these smart labels. I gave you the brief example earlier, but the fact that there's thinking around biodegradable technology that literally to activate the battery, it's torn or cut. And then you have everything that's within this now simple and very neatly packaged smart label that can dissolve again and be very biodegradable and environmentally safe. Not to mention the efficiencies that and effectiveness it brings relative to being able to track and trace products. It's not only going to be designed now for higher, more expensive products that are being shipped, but they're also going to get the costing down in such a way that it's going to be applied to the masses. I think that's where you're really going to see the economies of scale kick in, lowering the cost even more, and you're going to see that really begin to expand within the marketplace. And then the last point really was around the robotics piece and cobotics. I think this has always been the lingering question and concern around robotics, and is it taking away of jobs? Certainly on some jobs, they're finding where robots will be able to manage that, again, from just optimizing and being very highly effective and efficient. I think at the same time, though, you're going to look for this continued kind of cobotics thinking. It's going to be designed as a complementary technology that's going to work with people and not necessarily look at just consumption of jobs and finding more efficiencies and not providing still opportunities for growth out of in other areas. So certainly it's a difficult longer term issue that's going to need to be addressed, but I think a lot of these are very exciting technologies, and I certainly see a lot of opportunity for certainly revenue and profitable growth around each of these, and we're going to see nothing but an acceleration kind of post-pandemic. Okay. Kavita, that's what I have.
Yeah, I think there's a question here that just popped up on the chat too, Mike. What are your thoughts on asset disposition services purchasing customers' used assets in the future?
Well, and again, it depends on there's a lot of depends, let me say that. One part of that I think is with what's going on the consumer side, with all of just the mass sourcing again on e-commerce, I think there's a lot of return kind of B stock product and ultimately where now that goes. If it's an asset that's coming from a commercial asset, I think beyond the standard that we have on security, but I think again, with all things, there's going to be the ability to repurpose if there's a value there. If there's a value there that can be perceived, and it can be perceived in a credible way, in a reliable way, I think it's a very interesting question on where will that go ultimately. Technology is changing so fast. We're always going to have companies that are on the leading edge really of adoption of new technology and first to market. But certainly you'll see on the laggard part of the economy and commercial, I think you may see some of that where people just, I don't either need that resource at that cutting edge, or at the end of the day, maybe I just can't afford it. And it's going to be really tied to, I think, is it a credible value that can be brought by them?
Thank you. Well, with that, I think we can wrap this up. Wanted to thank everyone again for making time. And as usual, if you guys have any questions at all, Jana, Mike, myself, feel free to reach out to us. And also a reminder just to access all of the research and information that the GTDC has on our homepage. There's no charge for any of that research. So with that, thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of the day and stay safe out there.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.